Hello there, guys. Welcome back to Custer's 7th Cavalry in 7 minutes, or however long it takes me to talk really fast. Today we're going to discuss the life of Major Marcus Reno. You guys have probably heard of a thing called Custer's luck, which was used to define the ability of George Armstrong Custer to be at the right place at the right time. Well, I think there's a flip side to that. It should be called Reno's luck, because Major Marcus Reno had horrible luck. He had career issues, family problems, lots of women troubles, multiple court-martials, and a court of inquiry. So even though he survived the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he still led a pretty tragic life. Thanks for joining me.
Marcus Albert Reno was born on November 15, 1834 in Carrollton, Illinois. His parents owned the Union Hotel and his family lived there. In 1848, his mother died of a lingering illness, and then his father died of smallpox just 7 months later. Reno was an orphan at 15, and he moved into the home of one of his father's business partners. He clerked for this man, but what Reno really wanted was to get into the United States Military Academy at West Point. West Point then, as it is today, was really difficult to get into, but free. Luckily for Reno, a congressman who had sometimes stayed at his father's inn recommended him as a candidate, and Reno was accepted. He was only 16. He is described as being 5 feet 8 inches, dark-haired, brown-eyed, with a dark complexion. He arrived at West Point in August 1851. It was anything but easy. By the end of his 3rd year, he exceeded the maximum amount of demerits, but West Point let it slide this time. During his 4th year, Reno challenged another cadet to a fight, called him a coward, and tried to gouge out his opponent's eyes. A cadet wrote in his journal, "Reno is not very popular." This verdict seemed to follow Reno for most of his life. In March of 1855, instead of preparing for graduation, Reno again exceeded the demerit limit and had to redo the entire year. The next year was no better. He was court-martialed for arguing with one of his instructors, suspended, and had to repeat his final year again. He finally graduated in June 1855 and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant and assigned to the 1st Dragoons at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, where he helped train cavalry recruits. In March 1858, Reno was sent out west to Fort Walla Walla in Washington Territory. From there, Reno was sent to find the survivors of one of the worst Indian massacres on the Oregon Trail, the Utter Van Ornum Party Massacre. This group of pioneers had started out with 44 people, 21 of whom were children. Reno and his men found and buried the bodies of women and men who had been tortured and killed. Of the 44, only 10 survived. In early 1862, Reno was transferred east to fight the Civil War. While he was on detached service in Harrisburg, buying horses for the cavalry, he met his future wife, Mary Hannah Ross. He was 28, she was 18. In the words of her sister, taken from a private letter in the private collection of Steve Custer of North Slope Books, Marcus Albert Reno, Captain 1st Cavalry, U.S. He has been here since winter, recruiting and mustering troops. He met Hannah and both lost their hearts. He made her his recruit, and all was over. He is a very nice brother-in-law. Mary Hannah's family was rather wealthy. Their wedding was supposed to take place in this church with 300 people, but the Confederates interfered, seizing and burning Carlisle Barracks. It was feared they'd take Harrisburg next. So Reno and Mary Hannah had a small wedding ceremony in New York City before Reno immediately returned to his troops. Reno and Mary Hannah lived here at her family's home whenever they were reunited, and that's me at their house at Harrisburg this past summer. Their son Ross was a honeymoon baby. He was born 9 months after the wedding in April 1864. Reno participated in plenty of Civil War battles, including Antietam, Kelly's Ford, Trevilian Station, and Sheridan's Shenandoah Valley campaign, and he was brevetted more than once for gallantry. After the war, now Captain Reno tried to get posted in Harrisburg or Carlisle so Mary Hannah and baby Ross could remain close to home. Instead, the Renos were sent to West Point, and again, West Point proved unfriendly. Reno did not like their assigned quarters or that he was teaching infantry rather than cavalry tactics. When he complained, he was relieved from duty, and he and his family were sent to Fort Walla Walla. After a few years, Reno was promoted to major and transferred to the 7th Cavalry in Kansas. Major Reno reported with his family to Fort Hays in late summer 1869. Reno joined the 7th Cav after the Washita fight. It was at Fort Hays that Reno had an altercation with Captain Benteen at the Traders. Benteen said Reno attempted to, quote, bully him, and Benteen claimed he called Reno a dirty SOB. While posted at Fort Hays, Reno was often in the field trying to stop Indian attacks in Kansas and Colorado, but Mary Hannah and Ross had other 7th Cav family members nearby, like Libby Custer, Eliza DeRudio and her daughters, Kate Benteen and her young son, Freddie. In 1871, Reno and several companies of the 7th Cav were sent to the Carolinas in an attempt to weed out the Ku Klux Klan. In 1872, he joined the board selecting a new weapon system for the Army in New York. General Alfred Terry was the president of that board. After 10 months, they chose the 1873 model Springfield carbine, which was what the soldiers were using during the Little Bighorn fight. Meanwhile, Mary Hannah and Ross had stayed in Harrisburg to care for Mary Hannah's ill mother. When Reno returned west to the 7th Cav in 1873, Mary Hannah did not go with him. Reno commanded the military escort that protected the Northern Boundary Survey Commission that mapped the boundary between the U.S. and Canada. With him were Companies D, led by Captain Thomas Weir, and Company I, led by Captain Miles Keogh. Then Reno's mother-in-law died, and he took leave in October 1873 to late April 1874. He extended his leave to about 6 months because Mary Hannah was now ill with what seemed like kidney disease. Reno reported back to Fort Totten in May 1874, again to escort the Northern Boundary Survey, also with Companies D and I. In July 1874, Mary Hannah suddenly died. She was only 30. Reno received this terrible news by telegram, but his request for leave was denied by General Terry. Reno did not make it back to his wife's funeral or to his son in Harrisburg until late September. At that time, Reno was given leave, and he took his 10-year-old Ross to Europe and to Russia. He was away from the 7th Cav on this vacation for nearly a year. When he returned to America, he settled his wife's estate, which entitled him to more than $35,000, which equals about $1 million today. Reno left Ross with his in-laws and arrived at Fort Abraham Lincoln, assuming command on November 1st, 1875, as Colonel Sturgis was on detached service, and Lieutenant Colonel Custer had just gone on leave himself to New York. President Ulysses Grant had just declared an ultimatum ordering roaming Indians to move onto their reservations in early January 1876, or else the Army would put them there. In Sturgis and Custer's absence, Reno was tasked with getting the companies at Fort Lincoln ready for that coming campaign. At one point, Reno brought formal charges against Captain Weir for missing a battalion drill and then flaunting the fact by walking around while the drill was taking place. General Terry dismissed these charges, but this shows that Reno had a history of clashes with Thomas Weir, as he had with others. When Custer was summoned to testify in Washington, D.C., Reno twice requested to lead the upcoming summer campaign without him, first asking General Terry and then going all the way up to General Sheridan. Both generals rejected Reno's request. Custer returned to Fort Lincoln just in time on May 11th and was probably not happy to learn that Reno had repeatedly tried to replace him. Then the 7th Cavalry, all the companies united for the first time, left Fort Lincoln on May 17, 1876. Reno's first action of note was a scout on June 10th. He led 6 companies with a Gatling gun and the Arikara Scouts on reconnaissance. For all of those who wonder why Custer didn't bring the Gatling guns to the Little Bighorn fight, please know the Gatling guns greatly slowed Reno's scout down. Reno returned to Terry's column on June 20th, and his findings were mixed. He had exceeded Terry's orders. He had gone farther west than Terry wanted. Reno risked alerting the hostile Indians of his presence, but he was also able to discern that the Indians were only about a day and a half ahead. Custer was furious, thinking that Reno had ruined any chance of the 7th Cavalry surprising the Indians. He also thought, since Reno had gotten so close to the amassed tribes, that Reno ought to have attacked. On June 28th, the 7th Cavalry, joined together again, was given all the best scouts, and they all departed from Terry's main column. They tracked the growing number of Indians until the fateful morning of June 25th, when Custer, fearing the Sioux and Cheyenne had seen him, ordered an attack. Custer told Reno, who was second in command that day, quote, "The Indians are about 2.5 miles away on the jump. Follow them as fast as you can and charge them wherever you find them, and we will support you." Major Reno, who was called, quote, "Man with a dark face" by the Indian scouts, after crossing the Little Bighorn River, proceeded down the valley with companies M, A, and G. As Reno grew closer to the villages and saw that the Indians were not retreating, he sent 2 messengers to Custer, but he did not receive a message from Custer in return. Reno had about 165 men with him. He was convinced the Indians were planning an ambush. He halted the charge and threw out a skirmish line. The skirmish line did not last long before soldiers began to accumulate in the timber to the right. In the timber, Reno was trying to decide what to do next when a soldier was shot nearby, and then the Indian scout Bloody Knife, who was right next to Reno, was shot in the head. Reno would later say that Bloody Knife's blood and brains splattered all over him. Convinced the Indians had infiltrated the timber, Reno told the men to mount, then dismount, then mount again, and then he said, "Men, we are surrounded. Draw your revolvers and follow me." Unfortunately, there were no trumpet calls signaling the retreat, and the order to leave the timber was not widely dispersed. There are many contradictory accounts of what happened next. The first soldiers out may have initially maintained columns, but by the end, as Dr. Porter testified, there was, quote, "no order at all. Every man seemed to be running on his own hook." There was also no defense of the retreat, and Indian eyewitnesses said their chasing and killing of the fleeing soldiers was a buffalo hunt. More than 30 men were killed and many soldiers wounded, and at least a dozen men had been left behind in the timber. Reno reached the top of the bluff and was met by Captain Frederick Benteen and his own column. Benteen showed Reno the final order he'd received from Custer. "Come on, be quick, big village, bring packs." But Reno said, "For God's sake, Benteen, halt your command and help me. I've lost half my men." And Benteen remained with Reno. Depending on the witness, it took Reno up to 2 hours to finally go toward Custer, and only after Captain Weir had moved out with just his D Company, wrote one officer's wife to author Cyrus Townsend Brady. The splendid officers of the 7th, who had followed Custer so faithfully, begged Major Reno to let them try to join the general. They cried like women, they swore, they showed their contempt for the coward, but the discipline of their lives as soldiers prevented them disobeying until it was too late. You know Colonel Weir tried. The 7th did not get very far before being turned back by the Indians returning from destroying Custer's command. The 7th Cav remained on Reno-Benteen Hill, fending off their foe, making attempts to get water for the wounded, and just trying to stay alive until Terry's command came up on the morning of June 27th. Then they were sent to bury their comrades, and Reno would describe the Custer battlefield as a scene of sickening horror. Reno's behavior at the Little Bighorn faced harsh criticism. Though he participated in charges to keep the Indians back on Reno-Benteen Hill, it was understood that Captain Benteen was really in charge. Camp talk and gossip about Reno continued and made it into the newspapers. He finally called for a court of inquiry to clear his name, which was held in Chicago in 1879. 23 witnesses gave very varied testimony. Some defended Reno's retreat from the valley as the only chance they had of getting out alive. Others said he should have stayed in the fight and that the valley position was a good one. And if you'd like more info, please see my Reno Court of Inquiry videos. They go into much more detail. Ultimately, the court ruled the conduct of the officers throughout was excellent, and while subordinates in some instances did more for the safety of the command by brilliant displays of courage than did Major Reno, there was nothing in his conduct which required animadversion from this court. So while he was officially cleared, the verdict seemed to damn him with faint praise, and the rumors continued to plague him. It did not help that Reno racked up 2 court-martials for conduct unbecoming involving family members of fellow 7th officers. During the Christmas season of 1876, not long after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he made unwelcome advances on Emily Bell, the wife of one of his subordinates. When she rejected him, he spread rumors until her husband brought charges. Reno was found guilty and suspended. In 1879, less than a year after his court of inquiry, Reno was caught late at night looking in the window at Ella Sturgis, the daughter of the commander of the 7th, General Sam Sturgis. Reno was court-martialed for this, plus charges of drunkenness and for hitting a fellow officer. This was his third strike. He was dishonorably discharged on April 1st, 1880. Reno tried everything in his power to be reinstated and failed. He married a Navy widow, Isabella Ray McGonigal, in 1882, but the union was unhappy and they divorced. His life continued to slide downhill. He wrote a letter to former President Rutherford B. Hayes, calling him a fraud, a hypocrite, and a liar. And during an interview for the Army and Navy Journal, he said Custer hid behind a tree during Civil War fights, and that Custer was not a gallant fighter. This interview infuriated military readers. In October of 1888, a local Harrisburg paper reported Reno was acting queerly, had tried to commit suicide, was drinking too much, and his mind had become unbalanced. But it wasn't drinking that got him in the end. It was smoking. In March of 1889, he was diagnosed with tongue cancer. He died just 2 weeks later, March 30th, 1889, from complications from the surgery to remove the cancerous growth from his tongue. Reno was only 54 years old. He was not buried next to Mary Hannah in the family plot in Harrisburg. The Rosses said the family plot was full, so he was buried in an unmarked grave in Washington, D.C., and that's a picture of the family plot. I don't know, but there sure seems like there was room for Reno to me. It was in 1967 that his case was reopened when a researcher found a great-nephew, Charles Reno. One of the motivations for reviewing the case was to allow Reno to be buried at the National Cemetery at Little Bighorn Battlefield. The board ruled Reno's records were to be corrected, and the dishonorable discharge was changed to honorable discharge. On September 9th, 1967, Major Marcus Reno was buried with full military honors, and in this, his life and military career were in some way redeemed. I'm going to end with something Reno wrote, and it was found among his effects after his death, and it gives insight into the last decade of his life. Quote, "Even now, after the lapse of nearly 10 years, the horror of Custer's battlefield is still vividly before me, and the harrowing sight of those mutilated and decomposing bodies crowning the heights on which poor Custer fell will linger in my memory till death." If you want to learn more about Reno, Ron Nichols' book, In Custer's Shadow, is an incredible resource, and I relied on it heavily today.
Well, you guys are awesome. Thank you for joining me. Thanks also to Dale Kosman for his help, fact-checking, editing, all around, making sure I don't put my foot in my mouth too much. Thanks to Bill Rini and to Nathan Simons for finding some really hard to locate information on Major Marcus Reno. Guys, please like, subscribe, put on your notification bell, stay tuned for more, leave me a comment, and check out the description box because I'll put a few links in there if you want to learn more on your own. Okay, hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye.